The watch chime had already sounded twice before I lifted the stylus. The neophyte on the slab breathed in shallow draws, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a body that has not yet decided whether to accept what has been placed inside it. The apothecarian beneath deliverance smelled of counterseptic fluid and cold stone, and something older beneath both, something that had soaked into the bedrock over 10,000 years of surgical rites, performed in silence and without ceremony. The Raven Guard do not mark these moments with song. We do not gather witnesses. The implantation of gene seed is a private covenant between the flesh and the legacy it carries forward, and it is conducted in near darkness, because the chapter's sons have always worked best where light does not linger. I was alone in the vault. That was protocol. One apothecary, one neophyte, one slate of certification. The litany of shadow had been recited. The organs had been placed according to prescribed sequence. The monitoring arrays showed stable integration across 7 of the 12 implanted organs, with the remaining 5 requiring another 4 to 6 days before full absorption could be confirmed. My role in this moment was assessment and attestation, nothing more. I had performed this work 319 times over a career that had stretched through 2 full crusades and a border suppression that lasted 11 years. I knew the feel of a healthy implantation, the color of good integration, the sound a neophyte's breathing makes when the melochromic organ begins to settle. This one was quieter than it should have been. The pallor had come on during the final stage, during the placement of the omophagia, which was the organ I always watched most carefully, because it was the one that changed a boy's relationship to the world in ways that were difficult to measure and impossible to fully explain. The skin around his collar had drained first, then his face, then his hands. Not the grey pallor of shock or blood loss. Something more deliberate, as though the body were not abandoning pigment, but deliberately refusing it, drawing light inward rather than reflecting it outward. His eyes had dilated in the regulated lumen light of the vault, and he had turned his face away from the overhead strips, with a motion that was too controlled to be involuntary. I had checked the gene seed registers. I had run the monitor arrays through their full diagnostic cycle. I had pressed 2 fingers to his pulse point and counted the beat against my internal chronometer. Everything returned within acceptable parameters. The catechism I had memorized in my first year of apothecary service stated, with the flat certainty of doctrine, that deviation in initial presentation was often a function of individual physiology, encountering collective legacy for the first time. That the sons of Korax had always been drawn to shadow, and that pallor was no sin. That what appeared to the uninitiated eye as wrongness was frequently the earliest sign of correct adaptation to the chapter's particular inheritance. I had recited that catechism to myself while I watched the neophyte lie still and pale and silent, and I had found that it fit the situation well enough to permit conclusion. I signed the parchment slate. The certification read, "Genetic integration within acceptable parameters. Neophyte declared fit for continued implantation schedule. No deviations recorded requiring sanction review." I extinguished the ritual candles in the prescribed sequence, left to right, largest to smallest. The vault returned to its baseline illumination, which was dim enough that a normal human would have found it difficult to see clearly. I could see perfectly. The neophyte lay on his slab, with his eyes half open and his pallor undiminished. And in the low light of the vault, I noticed that the shadow he cast did not fall in quite the direction I expected. I told myself this was my own fatigue. The third campaign year had been relentless. Replenishment demands had pushed implantation schedules to their upper tolerance limits, and I had performed 9 procedures in the last 14 days, each one drawing from the same gene stock tithe that had arrived from the deep vaults 6 weeks prior. The tithe had been sanctified. The manifest had been countersigned by 3 separate authorities, one of whom held rank above my own chapter assignment. Questioning it now would have required documentation, justification, and a formal request for suspension that would have triggered review processes lasting months. The campaign could not sustain months. The watch had changed. A new apothecary would arrive within the hour to begin the morning cycle. I compiled my notes, sealed the monitoring arrays, and left the vault. I have tried to identify, across all the years that followed, the precise moment when escape became impossible. The honest answer is that it had already been impossible before I arrived in the vault that night. The gene stock batch had already been allocated. The implantation schedule had already been set. The tithe manifest had already been countersigned and filed with the Crusade's administrative apparatus. My role on that final watch had been to perform the last procedure in a sequence that had begun 6 weeks earlier, and the sequence had only ever been moving in one direction. But I signed the slate. That much is mine to carry. The initiate's name, as recorded in the neophyte register, was Sable Thomas Erevane, formerly of the 7th prison moon beneath Kievar, where aspirants were drawn from a population that had spent generations in the near-total darkness of subservice detention warrens. He had been selected for his silence, his physical endurance, and his exceptional spatial awareness in low-visibility environments. These were ideal traits for a son of the Raven. I should note this, because his name appears only twice more in the records I was permitted to keep, and then not at all. The apothecarian at Deliverance was not the grand surgical theatre of some chapters. There were no marble columns, no devotional murals, no serfs standing attendance in ceremonial robes. It was functional architecture, hewn from the same dark basalt that composed the fortress monastery's lower levels, with the same narrow corridors and deliberately suppressed acoustics that characterized all Ravengard construction. Sound did not carry here. Voices did not echo. The chapter's builders had understood something that most imperial architects forgot, that silence is not an absence, but a design element, something you have to construct with the same intentionality you bring to walls and vaultings. I had always found this beautiful. The silence of deliverance was not the silence of something missing. It was the silence of something held. That distinction would become harder to maintain in the years that followed. The morning cycle brought 3 more procedures from the same gene stock batch. 2 male aspirants and 1 female, all drawn from Kievar's prison moon populations. All 3 displayed the same progression during Omophageia integration. The pallor, the reflexive recoil from direct light, the quality of stillness that exceeded what shock or systemic response typically produced. I noted the pattern in my working log and cross-referenced against historical implantation records from the Vault's archive. Similar presentations appeared in records from 2 prior centuries. Both entries concluded with the same assessment: acceptable variation within chapter-specific gene expression range. I wrote the same conclusion in my own entry. I signed 3 more slates. The litany of shadow which I recited over each of them in turn, is not a long recitation. It consists of 7 passages, each drawing from the oldest layers of chapter liturgy, and it concerns itself primarily with the concept of purposeful invisibility as a form of devotion. To be unseen is to be weapon rather than target. To exist in silence is to exist in potential. The sons of Korax do not stand before the enemy and announce themselves. They move through the spaces between announcement and consequence. And in that movement they carry the Primarch's original grief and the chapter's original purpose forward into the present. I had always found the litany steadying. It had a cadence built for low voices, a rhythm that matched the working pace of careful hands. And its language was concrete in the way that the best liturgy always is. Specific about procedure, specific about expectation, specific about consequence. It did not ask for feeling. It specified action. The sons of Korax do not perform emotion. They perform duty. And in the performance of duty, they become what the Primarch required them to be. By my 4th recitation of that morning, the words had settled into the automatism they were designed to achieve. My hands moved through the prescribed sequence of surgical preparation. My voice maintained the prescribed register. The initiates lay pale and still beneath my care, and the gene seed monitors returned acceptable readings. And I signed each slate in the same hand I had used the night before. I did not feel the cold in the air until I was halfway through the last procedure. The apothecarian's climate systems were maintained by tech marines assigned to Deliverance's infrastructure, and they operated within tight tolerances. The temperature in the surgical vault was logged and regulated at a constant level appropriate to biological work. I had never noticed it varying, but as I completed the final organ placement on the 3rd initiate of the morning cycle, the air against my exposed hands felt measurably cooler than it had been when I began. I checked my own gauntlets on the nearby equipment tray. I had removed them for the delicate work of placement, which was standard practice. The metal was at ambient temperature. The slate on the recording stand was at ambient temperature. The surgical tools were at ambient temperature. The initiate's skin, where my fingers rested for the pulse count, was not. It was not dramatically colder. It was not the cold of a body failing. It was a few degrees below what I expected. A marginal difference that my diagnostic implants registered as notable without flagging as critical. I completed the pulse count. The beat was strong and regular. The monitoring arrays showed stable integration. I signed the slate. Outside the vault, in the narrow corridor leading back to the apothecary's preparation chamber, the lumen globes that lined the upper curve of the arch appeared slightly dimmer than usual. I paused and looked up at them. They were functioning. The light they cast was the same pale blue-white it always was, but the shadows in the corridor felt heavier than the illumination justified, as though the light were working against resistance. I was tired. I had performed 4 procedures across 2 watch cycles, and had slept for less than 3 hours in between. I attributed what I was noticing to the distortions fatigue produces in sensory judgment, and continued to the preparation chamber. The commendation reports from Van Hollow Hive arrived 3 days later. The operation had been a night assault on a heretic supply column moving through the lower Spire districts. A standard interdiction mission assigned to a 10-man strike team that included 3 of the initiates implanted during the preceding weeks. The after-action summary described a flawless elimination of the target column, 0 friendly casualties, and complete mission success within a time window considerably shorter than operational planning had projected. I read the report twice. The efficiency metrics were exceptional. Kill-to-time ratios that a veteran squad would have been proud of. Enemy resistance neutralized before any coordinated response could be organized. The assault had proceeded so quietly that Mortal Auxilia, stationed 3 blocks from the engagement zone, had reported nothing until the Raven Guard voxed mission completion. This was not unusual for the chapter. We were built for exactly this kind of operation, and our reputation had been earned over 10,000 years of precisely this kind of outcome. I filed the report in the campaign record and returned to my morning duties. It was Brother Cranach, a battle brother of 8 years standing, who had served as the strike team's second in command, who flagged the irregularity during his debrief. I was not present for that debrief, but I received a copy of the Vox transcript as part of the post-engagement medical review I was required to conduct for any operation involving recently implanted initiates. Cranach had described a distortion in the helmet cam recordings. Not corruption or data loss, but something he called a recoil in the visual feed, a brief interval in which the footage appeared to pull backward from a section of the operational zone, as though the recording systems were declining to process what they were encountering. The interval lasted less than 4 seconds and occurred during the phase of the operation when the 3 new initiates were moving to close the eastern flank of the column. He had also reported, in a flat voice that the transcript annotated as controlled, that during the eastern flank movement, he had heard breathing on his Vox channel that did not correspond to any squad transponder. I reviewed the helmet cam recordings myself. The distortion was present exactly as described. 4 seconds of footage in which the visual data appeared to thin rather than corrupt, as though something in the field of capture was refusing to be captured. The 3 initiates appeared in the footage before and after the interval. During it, they were simply not recorded. Their transponder signatures had remained active throughout the operation. I performed the post-engagement gene scans that had been requested of me. The readings returned pristine results across all measured parameters. Integration was proceeding within normal bounds. No mutation markers. No warp reactivity indicators. Nothing that the sanctified instruments of the chapter designated as deviation. I filed the scans with a notation of satisfactory post-engagement status. I did not include the helmet cam irregularity in my medical report because it was not a medical finding. It was a technical irregularity that belonged to the Tech Marine review process, not my own. I told myself this was the correct allocation of responsibility. I told myself this was not the same as choosing not to see. The chapel of the blackened wing occupied a high level in Deliverance's central spire, carved from a single vaulting chamber whose ceiling rose high enough that the upper portions were permanently lost in shadow, regardless of how many braziers burned at the floor level. The chaplains used this architectural quality with deliberate intent. When you stood before a chaplain in the blackened wing, you were aware at all times that the ceiling was present but invisible, and that awareness created a specific kind of posture in the body, a tendency to keep the shoulders slightly drawn, to maintain a quieter voice, to experience the weight of hierarchy as something structural rather than interpersonal. I attended the Reclusium review 3 weeks after Van Hollow. The initiate Erevane was brought before Chaplain Torvas, one of the senior members of the Raven Guard's Reclusium, a man whose service record was longer than most Battle Brothers' total years of existence. He carried the Crozius Arcanum with the ease of a limb, and his face behind the skull visage of his helm had the particular stillness of someone who has stopped performing authority and simply become it. The initiate knelt. The chamber was quiet in the way that all Raven Guard spaces were quiet, with that constructed quality I had always admired. But this quiet had something additional to it, something I noticed in the way my own breathing felt slightly overloud in my ears. Torvasa administered the loyalty catechism in a voice so low it might have been intended only for the initiate. The 27 questions of the catechism moved through theology, doctrine, personal history, and psychological assessment in a sequence designed over centuries to surface deviation in loyalty through the pressure of precise language. Every question had a correct answer. Every deviation from the correct answer triggered a follow-up question that pressed harder on the same point. The initiate answered every question without hesitation and without deviation. His voice was level. His body language was controlled. His eyes remained focused on the middle distance in the posture the catechism expected from a kneeling Astartes. He did not fidget. He did not rush. He recited the oaths of loyalty in the prescribed register and completed each one with the seal phrase that marked his understanding of what he had sworn. Torvasa declared him loyal. I watched the initiate rise and turn to depart. The braziers at the chamber's perimeter cast their light in the warm directions that fire always moves, outward from the source, filling space, reaching into corners. The shadows in the chapel fell in the directions the brazier placement dictated. The initiate's shadow did not quite match the angle that the nearest brazier prescribed. It was subtle, the kind of thing that required specific attention and a precise understanding of light geometry to notice. The shadow fell in approximately the correct direction, but the angle was wrong by perhaps 3 or 4 degrees, and the shape of it was slightly thinner than the body it corresponded to should have produced, as though the light that struck him was not quite bouncing back the way light was supposed to. Torvasa had already moved away. The chaplain's attention was on the next matter of reclusium business. The initiate had cleared the arch and was gone. I said nothing. This was not entirely cowardice. It was partly that I was uncertain enough of what I had seen that making a formal report would have required claiming something I could not fully substantiate, and the chapter's culture of precision made unfounded claims as damaging as false ones. It was partly that the catechism had returned no flags, and that I had no medical basis for overriding a chaplain's loyalty declaration. It was partly that I was aware, with the particular awareness that comes from long service, that the system around me was already in motion, and that the motion had a weight I was not certain I could redirect. Mostly, I said nothing because I had already signed 4 slates. The Gene Vault audit occurred on the 42nd day of the 4th campaign month. Routine procedure, conducted every standard cycle, measuring the genetic integrity of all active implantations against baseline chapter records. I conducted it myself, which was my assigned responsibility, and I conducted it with the careful thoroughness that my training demanded and my conscience required. The microvariances I found in 3 additional neophytes were small enough that the monitoring arrays did not flag them automatically. I only identified them because I was looking carefully, because I had been looking carefully since Van Hollow, and because the parameters I was measuring against were the ones in my own memory, rather than the ones encoded in the standard assessment protocols. Melanin suppression, not absence, suppression. The pigmentation in the skin was present, but operating at a reduced expressive level, as though the mechanism that controlled it had been tuned down rather than switched off. Heat signatures measuring marginally below ambient. Metabolic output running lean, not critically, but consistently, in a pattern that was stable rather than declining, and a sensory tolerance profile for total darkness and total silence that exceeded the chapter average, significantly enough to constitute a defined outlier. None of these findings appeared in the standard mutation and deviation flagging system. The Magos biologist attached to the crusade, a figure named Tessevar, who maintained an axiomatic devotion to data over inference, reviewed my findings the following morning. Tessevar had been assigned to the crusade specifically to monitor the biological integrity of Astartes' complements, and he approached the work with the precise detachment of someone who has long since separated the concept of an organism from any investment in what it might experience. He studied my audit results for 11 minutes. I watched him process the data with the particular focus of a mind that navigates complexity through reduction rather than expansion. His assessment was measured. The characteristics I had identified were consistent with enhanced stealth phenotype expression, which was an adaptive response profile well within the documented range of Raven Guard physiological variation. Melanin suppression reduced visual cross-section in certain light conditions, reduced heat signature, minimized thermal detection exposure. Reduced metabolic output in downtime states was a recognized efficiency trait for operatives who spent extended periods in concealment. The sensory tolerance profile simply indicated that these individuals were exceptionally well suited to the chapter's operational doctrines. The Raven Guard were meant to disappear. These suns were disappearing slightly more completely than average. Tessevar found this unremarkable. He noted it in his own records with the annotation, beneficial adaptive variation, and moved on to the next item on his review schedule. I stood in the audit room for a moment after he left. The monitoring arrays hummed around me at their characteristic frequency. The gene seed vault beneath the floor held its contents in the regulated darkness that gene seed required. The air was cold in the controlled way of a properly maintained biological archive. I thought about the Raptor project. Every apothecary of the Raven Guard knew the sealed history in outline, even without access to the full records. It was part of the tradition of the chapter, passed from master to apprentice, not through formal documentation, but through the specific weight given to certain warnings, certain cautions, certain procedural requirements that existed in the implantation protocols without full explanation. After Istvan V, after the near destruction of the 19th Legion, Corvus Corax had gone to Terra and demanded of the Emperor's own gene vaults the knowledge necessary to rebuild what had been lost. He had received something. He had used it. And the results had been abominations. Not warriors, the things that wore the shape of Astartes without possessing the coherence that shape required. And they had been destroyed in shame, and the records had been sealed, and the methods had been officially condemned as the product of desperation rather than wisdom. These new initiates were not abominations. I had to be honest with myself about that. They were not physically aberrant. They were not psychologically destabilized. They performed exceptionally well in every assessment metric. They obeyed orders with precision. They integrated into squad structures without friction. They were, by every available measure, excellent Raven Guard. They were also becoming something that my instinct, for what an apothecary's instinct was worth, told me was not quite what the implantation rites were intended to produce. But instinct was not evidence. Tessivar had evidence. The monitoring arrays had evidence. The battle reports from Van Hollow had evidence. And the evidence all said the same thing, in different registers, using different terminologies, reaching the same conclusion from different starting points. These suns were working correctly. I authorized continued implantation from the same gene stock batch. The boarding action against the renegade cruiser, Voiceless Covenant, took place 6 weeks later. I was not part of the boarding party. My role during the action was to remain aboard the chapter's support vessel and prepare the surgical bay for casualties, which was standard practice for major close-quarters engagements. The strike team deployed at Third Bell. I tracked their transponder signatures from the surgical bay's auxiliary monitoring station as a matter of habit, and because it gave me something concrete to focus on during the wait. 11 Raven Guard, 3 of whom were from the altered gene stock cohort, moving through the cruiser's hull corridors toward the primary target, the command bridge, where a renegade admiral had been running a raiding campaign against Imperial supply lanes for the better part of a year. The initial breach went cleanly. Transponder signatures moved in the patterns I recognized from the strike team's training approach. Precise distribution of spacing, movement timed to expected patrol intervals, advance, followed by consolidation, followed by advance again. The surgical bay was quiet. I checked my instruments and waited. At 23 minutes past deployment, the 11 transponder signatures separated into 2 groups on the monitoring display. 8 transponders continued on the expected approach route to the command bridge. 3 diverged toward a secondary corridor that was not on the strike team's registered mission plan. Then those 3 transponders disappeared from the monitoring display. Not corruption, not signal loss from hull interference. I had worked with enough void ship signals to distinguish between interference degradation and clean absence. And this was clean absence. One moment the 3 signatures were present, moving at the pace of Astartes in measured advance. The next moment the display showed 8 signatures, and the 3 positions simply did not exist. I documented the timestamp. I ran the monitoring system through a diagnostic cycle. I checked the hull penetration signal parameters against the cruiser's known material composition. Nothing in the diagnostics explained the absence. For 11 minutes, only 8 Raven Guard existed on my monitoring display. The Vox traffic from the mission was controlled and minimal, as Raven Guard Vox traffic always was. During those 11 minutes, I heard the 8 transponder group complete their approach to the command bridge, breach the entry point, and engage with the bridge's security detail. The engagement sounds on the Vox were brief. The resistance sounds were briefer. A Raven Guard strike team clearing a bridge command detail was not a prolonged operation under any circumstances. At 34 minutes past deployment, all 3 absent transponders reappeared simultaneously. They were positioned at points distributed across 4 separate sections of the cruiser, sections that were not connected by any corridor route that would have allowed the movement their repositioning implied. The mission completed successfully at 37 minutes. No Raven Guard casualties. Enemy command structure eliminated. The cruiser's resistance had been neutralized in advance of the main boarding party's arrival, which the strike team reported as a result of the enemy's failure to detect their approach. The post-mission debrief was conducted in the surgical bay because 2 of the 8 transponder group had sustained minor wounds during the bridge engagement. I treated the wounds and listened to the debrief as I worked. Brother Evander, the squad's senior member, She reported the missing 11-minute interval with the same flat control that Cranach had brought to the Van Hollow debrief. He noted it as a data anomaly, provided the precise timestamps, described the absence as a signal irregularity he had been unable to explain, and stated that the enemy resistance in the sections his squad had not visited had been neutralized before his squad arrived. He had also, he reported, experienced a brief period during the engagement in which his memory of the immediate preceding minute felt as though it had been compressed. Not missing, compressed. As if a longer interval had been folded into a shorter one, leaving the outcome intact, but reducing the experiential texture of the path to it. I asked him to describe this more precisely. He said it was like reaching into a room to retrieve an object and finding the object in your hand without the intermediate memory of crossing the room being available. He did not appear alarmed by this. He reported it in the same register he used to report ammunition expenditure figures. I looked at the 3 initiates from the altered cohort who had not spoken during the debrief. They stood at the surgical bay's perimeter with their armor still closed. Their vital signs on the bay's monitoring arrays were within acceptable parameters. Their bearing was composed. Their eyes, in the minimal visibility of the surgical bay's operational lighting, were darker than I remembered from their implantation records. The one designated Eravane looked at me once during the debrief. It was a brief, level look. No expression that I could read, no communication that I could interpret. The monitoring array did not register any anomaly in his vital signs during that moment. I signed off on the operational integrity report. I noted the transponder irregularity as a technical anomaly requiring tech marine review, and the memory compression report as a potential post-engagement stress response requiring follow-up psychological assessment. I did not note what I had begun to think. What I had begun to think was that the inability to observe them was not a failure of our instruments. It was them. The gene stock vault designation was Theta 9 Vermilion, assigned in an archival system that predated the current chapter's administrative structure by several centuries. I found the designation by cross-referencing the Tithe Manifest against the Deep Archives cataloging index, which required 3 separate access requests and a formal justification addressed to the chapter's librarian staff that I worded as a routine historical research inquiry, rather than a specific investigation. The access was granted without comment. The Raven Guard's culture of internal information management was precise about what was sealed and less concerned with what was merely old. Theta 9 Vermilion had not been actively restricted. It had simply been old enough that nobody had recently thought to look at it. The Vault's origination record described a gene stock preparation conducted in the immediate aftermath of the Horus heresy, in the period when Corvus Corax had returned to Deliverance to supervise the chapter's reconstruction after the catastrophic losses at Istvan Fiof. The record was written in the careful, so compressed language of someone documenting actions they were not certain would be viewed favorably. Every phrase chosen to describe outcome without fully illuminating method. The Primarch had sought perfection in concealment. That was the summary the record offered. After the massacre at Istvan Fauv, where the 19th Legion had been reduced from near complete strength to a few surviving thousands, Corax had been obsessed with the question of why they had been seen. Why the traitors had been able to calculate the position of the loyalist legions. Why the darkness that should have concealed them had failed. The ambush had been prepared with foreknowledge, and that foreknowledge had required visibility where the 19th Legion believed itself invisible. The record described several years of post-heresy experimental work. It described the Primarch's conviction that the gene seed itself could be refined to resolve the visibility problem at its fundamental level. If the chapter's sons could be made to occupy a different relationship with the material spectrum, a relationship defined not by reduced visibility, but by genuine reduction in material presence, the failure of Istvan could not be repeated. The official history recorded the experimental outcomes of this period as failures, as the Raptor tragedy, as the condemned record of what desperation produces when it overreaches. But the official history had not known about Theta 9 Vermilion, or had chosen not to document it, or had documented it in records above my access level, and left the vault itself in the deep archive without explicit restriction. The vault had contained gene seed. This gene seed prepared from Primarch-level source material, subjected to the refinement process the record described in terms that my apothecary training translated with uncomfortable precision. The refinement had not been about producing monstrosities. The Raptor tragedy had been an entirely different project, one driven by urgency and imprecision. This work had been methodical, careful. The Primarch had understood what he was doing, or had believed he understood, which was not the same thing, but was close enough that the outcomes had been stable. The gene seed in Theta 9 Vermilion was what remained when the refinement succeeded. I sat in the archival reading alcove for a long time after I understood this. The ambient light in the alcove was exactly as it always was, the controlled blue-white of preserved records illumination. The silence was the constructed silence of Raven Guard architecture. I was sitting in it, and it felt, for the first time in my career, less like a design element and more like an inevitability. The Primarch had wanted sons who could not be seen. He had worked to produce them. He had, apparently, succeeded in some form that was stable enough to be preserved. And now those sons were being implanted. I deleted the copies I had made of the Theta 9 Vermilion origination record from my personal data slate. I returned the archival access to its previous state. I stood up from the alcove and walked back through the narrow Raven Guard corridors towards the apothecarian. The lumen globes in the corridor appeared to dim slightly as I passed under them. I did not stop to examine them. The barracks adjustment began subtly enough that I might have dismissed it entirely if I had not been attending to the spaces around the altered cohort with a watchfulness I was no longer entirely able to suppress. The mortal auxilia attached to the crusade were not cowards. They were militarum regulars, with multiple campaigns behind them, accustomed to the particular presence of Astartes in operational environments, familiar enough with the Raven Guard's culture of suppressed communication and controlled distance that they had long since stopped being unnerved by it. They were unnerved by this. The first evidence was serf-avoiding behavior. Chapter serfs assigned to the maintenance of armor and equipment for squads containing altered cohort members began to cluster their work schedules to minimize proximity time. Not refuse, minimize. They completed their assigned tasks but arrived later and departed sooner than their counterparts assigned to other squads. I noticed this because I was conducting routine health assessments of the chapter serfs as part of my expanded triage duties, and the pattern appeared in the temporal data of their movement logs. When I asked one of them, a serf named Puran, who had served the chapter for 16 years and maintained the armor of Brother Evander's squad with reliable precision, He was quiet for a moment before he said that the assigned sections felt cold. Not dramatically cold, just consistently a few degrees below what he expected, and that working in those sections for extended periods left him with an unusual difficulty in accounting for time afterward. He used the phrase, "it slides," which I did not find meaningful until I remembered what Brother Evander had said in the Surgical Bay debrief about memory compression. The servitors were more concrete. Servitors do not experience unease. They process inputs and execute functions. When a servitor malfunctions in proximity to a specific location or individual, it is a technical phenomenon with a technical cause. And the tech marines responsible for servitor maintenance will find that cause if they look carefully enough. 3 servitors assigned to the armor maintenance bay for Evander's squad had experienced intermittent motor function failures that the tech marines had been unable to trace to a specific component fault. The failures occurred only during operational periods when the bay was occupied by members of the altered cohort. They ceased when those members departed. The tech marines noted this in their maintenance logs as an unresolved environmental interference issue and continued to investigate. The lumen globes in corridors adjacent to the altered cohort's assigned quarters had also become unreliable. Not failing, dimming. The same phenomenon I had observed in the apothecarian was present here. Ambient illumination that appeared to be working against something, producing less light than the power consumption metrics indicated it should. I mentioned the corridor illumination pattern to one of the tech marines during a maintenance review. He examined the relevant segments, ran diagnostics, found no component failure, and replaced 2 globes as a precautionary measure. The replacements dimmed within 3 days. What I did not do was raise any of this formally. I had stopped raising things formally several weeks earlier, around the time I deleted the Theta 9 Vermilion archive copies. I continued to compile my private observations, not as a formal investigation, but as a habit of attention that I could not entirely abandon. But I had stopped committing those observations to records that move through official channels. I was not certain at that point whether this was prudence or complicity. I had also noticed, without fully acknowledging to myself that I was noticing, that my fellow apothecaries had become harder to engage on the subject of the altered cohort. This was not refusal. It was a specific kind of subject change that felt organic, but happened consistently enough to be a pattern. When I initiated conversations about the post-engagement physiological assessments, my colleagues would respond briefly and then redirect to other matters with the practiced fluency of people who have decided that a topic is not worth pursuing. I stopped initiating those conversations. The corridors near the altered cohort sections had become acoustically different over the preceding months. I was aware that this was a precise claim and that I lacked the instrumentation to verify it as a physical reality rather than a perceptual artifact. But the experience was consistent. Walking those sections felt like walking through spaces where sound was not quite arriving at the expected volume, where footsteps landed slightly quieter than the stone underfoot should have produced, where the ambient frequencies of the ship's systems seemed to thin rather than fill the air. I walked those sections less frequently. I told myself this was efficient time management. The Gene Tithe preparation meeting for the 5th campaign year's implantation schedule was convened by the chapter's senior logistical staff 49 days before the end of the 4th year. I attended as the apothecary of record for the current cohort's implantations. The meeting was held in the Crusade's administrative command chamber, a space with a long table and a hololithic display. showing the chapter's operational projection across the next 12 months. The tithe schedules were presented by the logistics adjutant, a battle brother of 15 years' service, who managed the chapter's biological resource allocation with the same methodical competence he brought to ammunition and ration calculations. The numbers were presented as numbers. Projected operational requirements in gene seed yield projections, implantation capacity constraints, aspirant recruitment forecasts from Kievar's moon populations. The altered gene stock from Theta 9 vermilion was included in the yield projections as a standard tithe component. It had been assigned a permanent designation in the chapter's current implantation catalogue, without, as far as I could determine, any formal decision point at which that assignment had been made. It had simply been included in the calculations because it had been included in the preceding year's calculations, and those had been included in the calculations before them, and the process had its own momentum in the way that administrative processes always do. I had prepared a set of concerns regarding the long-term genetic drift implications of scaling the altered strain. I had prepared them carefully, in measured language, framed as procedural cautions rather than objections. I had reviewed them 3 times to ensure they contained no claims I could not substantiate, and no language that could be read as challenging the sanctification status of the gene stock. When the presentation reached the tithe composition section, I opened my mouth. The logistics adjutant looked at me with the neutral attention of someone prepared to receive a contribution. I thought about the 4 slates I had signed in the vault. I thought about the 11-minute absence on the monitoring display. I thought about the Theta 9 vermilion origination record, of which I now possessed no copy. I thought about the corridor illumination and the servitor malfunctions and the serf's phrase, "It slides." I said that the yield projections appeared consistent with operational requirements and that I had no procedural concerns with the tithe composition as presented. The adjutant moved to the next agenda item. That was the moment I stopped having a meaningful relationship with the question of what I was doing. Not because the question stopped being present, because I had measured the weight of raising it against the weight of everything already in motion, and found that the arithmetic did not favor a voice. The tithe schedule was approved. The altered strain was integrated permanently into the chapter's campaign logistics. The implantation quota for the 5th year was set at 43 new neophytes, of whom approximately 60% would receive gene seed drawn from the Theta 9 vermilion stock. The meeting concluded. I returned to the apothecarian. 3 days later, a casualty report arrived from the ongoing campaign operations with an irregularity that I would not have noticed if I had not been watching for the specific kind of irregularity it represented. The report listed 1 battle brother as killed in action during a skirmish with a renegade armored column in the northern reaches of the operational zone. Standard format, standard content, name, designation, unit assignment, cause of death, confirming authority. My job was to receive the report, verify that gene seed recovery had been completed per protocol, and file the record. Gene seed recovery had been listed as completed. The confirming apothecary's seal was present. The form was correctly completed in every respect. There was no corpse designation in the report. The section where recovered physical remains were catalogued for internment had been left empty, with a notation that read no physical trace recovered at engagement site. I checked the engagement coordinates against the operational record. The skirmish had taken place in an open terrain zone, with no conditions that would explain the absence of a body. The battle brother had not been destroyed by ordnance capable of vaporizing physical remains. He had been listed as killed in a small arms and blade engagement. I submitted a clarification request to the confirming apothecary. The response came back within an hour. Physical recovery had not been possible because no physical remains had been found at the site. The engagement had been concluded. The zone had been secured, and there was simply nothing there. The battle brother had been killed. His gene seed had been recovered by the unit's integrated medical system, which was automated for exactly these situations. His body was not present. I looked at the name in the casualty report. I looked at the unit assignment. He was one of the altered cohort. I filed the report. I noted the remains status as not recovered and attributed it, in my filing notation, to post-engagement environmental displacement, which was a category that existed in the documentation system for situations where remains were lost to water, fire, or other destructive conditions. I used that category because it was there, because using it completed the form, because the form needed to be completed. The pattern I assembled over the following weeks, working from casualty reports and deployment logs and post-engagement gene scan records, required a particular kind of attention to notice. Each individual data point was unremarkable. The altered cohort performed exceptionally. Their casualty rates were lower than average, their efficiency metrics higher, their post-engagement physiological indicators consistently within acceptable parameters. Every individual record was a record of success. The pattern only appeared when you looked at what was not in the records. Corpse recovery rates for the altered cohort ran at 63%, compared to a chapter-wide average of 91%. This was logged and explained in each individual case by the available circumstances, difficult terrain, enemy action preventing recovery, engagement conditions incompatible with physical retrieval. Each explanation was plausible. None of them was implausible. But 63% over a sample of 37 casualties across 2 years was not a distribution that terrain and engagement conditions fully accounted for. Memory assessment scores for battle brothers serving in squads that included altered cohort members had also declined on the standardized psychological maintenance protocols. The decline was in a specific category of memory function, designated continuous experiential recall, which measured the fidelity of event memory over time. The Raven Guard placed significant operational value on this function because precise recall of operational environments was central to the chapter's planning methodology. The decline was gradual. It fell within the range that the protocols attributed to normal operational stress accumulation, but it was present, and it was present at higher rates in squads with altered cohort integration than in squads without. I thought about Brother Evander and his phrase about reaching into a room and finding the object in your hand. I thought about the Surf Paran and his phrase about time sliding. I thought about the recordings from Van Hollow, where 4 seconds of footage had thinned rather than corrupted. I thought about the word Tessevar had used in his Margos biologist assessment. Attenuation. The Raven Guard were not becoming monstrous. The initiate in the implantation vault had not screamed. He had gone pale and quiet and still, and he had recoiled from the light, and he had grown into an exceptional warrior, whose shadow fell at a slightly wrong angle, and whose body produced less warmth than it should, and who could, for 11 minutes in the depths of a renegade void ship, cease to exist in any measurable register, while simultaneously eliminating resistance in multiple locations simultaneously. They were becoming less, not less capable, less present. The relationship between their existence and the material world was changing in the direction the Primarch had sought to achieve 10,000 years ago, and it was changing at the scale the chapter was providing through continued implantation. And the direction of change was not towards something more, but towards something more precisely targeted. Warriors who occupied the world less fully, and the shadow between presence and absence more completely. I took out my documentation tools. I reviewed what I had compiled. I organized it into a format that was coherent, cautious, and supported exclusively by documented evidence. I wrote the report for the chapter master. The response came back in 48 hours, which was faster than I expected, and faster than the processing time for a formal concern submission usually allowed. The response was signed by the chapter master's chief adjutant and copied to the Crusade's senior chaplain and to the Ordo Astartes liaison, who had been embedded with the Crusade for the past 7 months. The content was brief and formal and complete. The gene stock from Theta 9 Vermilion had been reviewed by sanctification authorities prior to its inclusion in the chapter's active tithe. Those reviews had been conducted under appropriate protocols and had returned appropriate results. The characteristics the apothecary had identified were consistent with sanctioned adaptive variation within the Raven Guard's particular genetic inheritance. The Raven Guard had always operated in the space between visibility and concealment. The chapter's founding doctrine embraced this as identity, not anomaly. The successes of the current crusade were noted as evidence of operational health. The apothecary's concern regarding long-term genetic drift was acknowledged as demonstrating conscientious attention to duty. However, the appropriate response to concerns of this nature was referral to the sanctification authorities who possessed the expertise and mandate to evaluate them, not suspension of operations. Those authorities had already evaluated the relevant materials and had found no basis for intervention. The apothecary was commended for his dedication and reassigned from implantation oversight duties to battlefield triage support, effective immediately. His access to Vault Theta 9 Vermilion and the associated archival levels was revoked as part of the access rationalization, accompanying his new role's scope. The implantation schedule would continue under the supervision of Apothecary Dravan, who had been assigned to replace him in the role. There was a final paragraph about the importance of operational continuity. I read the response twice. The language was correct. The procedure it described was correct. The commendation was formally appropriate, given the framing of my submission. Everything about the communication was exactly as it should have been, right down to the seal and the distribution list and the response timeline. They had not been alarmed. They had been prepared. The Ordo Astartes liaison, a compact figure named Assessor Vane, who had the cultivated neutrality of someone whose profession required them to spend significant periods being neither an ally nor an enemy, requested a formal interview 3 days after my reassignment. The interview was conducted in the Crusade's administrative wing, in a room with a single table and 2 chairs that had been placed at an angle, suggesting conversation rather than interrogation, which was a choice that told me something about how this meeting had been classified in Vane's documentation. Vane presented my concerns back to me in précis form, demonstrating that he had read my report carefully and understood its structure. He then worked through each concern individually, next providing documented counterpoints from the sanctification reviews and from the operational record. He was thorough and methodical and entirely devoid of hostility. His conclusion was that the apothecary had identified genuine operational anomalies that had been appropriately reviewed by the relevant authorities and found to represent sanctioned adaptation rather than deviation requiring intervention. He noted that the Raven Guard's genetic inheritance was unusual within the Astartes corpus, that their founding doctrine specifically valorized characteristics that other chapters would flag as concerning, and that the assessment of what constituted normal versus aberrant required contextual expertise that standard genetic monitoring protocols were not designed to supply. He found no evidence of heresy, mutation, or warp taint, no demonic influence, no corruption, only adaptation. He used that word in exactly the way Tessevar had used it. The same word, the same register, the same comfortable confidence in a technical categorization that resolved the difficulty by renaming it. I did not argue. I had not come to argue. I had submitted a concern through appropriate channels and received an appropriate response. And the interview was a follow-up procedure within a process that had already been completed before the interview began. What I did not do was ask Vane whether he had looked at the corpse recovery rates. He would have had an answer for that too. He had answers for everything, not because he was unintelligent or dishonest, but because the system he represented had been generating answers to questions of this kind for 10,000 years and had become very good at it. The system's answer to the question of what the Raven Guard were becoming was, they are becoming what they were always meant to be. I accepted the reassignment. I turned in my access credentials for Vault Theta 9 Vermilion and the associated archive levels. I relocated my working materials to the triage bay that would be my primary operational station going forward. Apothecary Drevan, who replaced me in the implantation role, was younger than me by 20 years and had no access to the private documentation I had compiled, which I had not included in any official records and which existed only in my personal data slate. The memory-sanctioned servitor arrived 11 days after the interview with Vane. I had heard of hypno-conditioning within the chapter, but had never been subject to it. It was used rarely for specific categories of operational disruption, and the category mine fell under was described in the formal notification as unproductive fixation on resolved concerns. The phrasing was clinical without being punitive, which was, I recognized, the tone of a system administering a correction it considered entirely routine. The process would involve 2 sessions of directed hypnosuggestion, each lasting approximately 3 hours, administered by a librarian with specific training in the technique. The sessions would not erase memory, but would recontextualize it, dulling the anxiety response patterns that attach to certain memory sequences without removing the sequences themselves. The result was typically described as a reduction in intrusive recurrence. The memories would remain accessible, but would no longer surface unbidden with the urgency they currently carried. The formal notification described this as for the good of the Imperium and for the operational harmony of the Crusade. The servitor that accompanied the notification was a documentation unit assigned to record my formal acknowledgement of the procedure and to witness my compliance. It had no other function. It was not capable of compelling my attendance or enforcing the schedule. Compliance was assumed. I acknowledged the notification. I recorded my compliance. I attended the first session on the scheduled day. The librarian who administered the process was a figure I knew slightly, named Corvaris, one of the chapter's senior epistolaries. He worked in silence, which was appropriate, and he explained the process briefly and without effect before beginning. He described what I would experience and what I would retain and what would change. lay back in the reclining frame, the process required, and looked at the ceiling of the librarium chamber, which was vaulted stone, carved with the same compressed silence as every other ceiling in Deliverance. The silence felt different from the inside of the chair. It felt closer. The process was exactly as Corvaris had described it. There was no drama, no pain, no sensation of loss or violation. It was more like standing in a room you have been standing in for a long time, and gradually having the room's harder edges padded, the sharper corners rounded, the most insistent frequencies in the ambient sound brought down to a level where they were present but no longer demanding attention. When I stood up from the chair after the first session, the documentation of my concerns was still present in my memory. I could recall the specific events: the vault, the pallor, the shadow angle, the 11-minute absence, the Theta 9 vermilion origination record. I could recall the pattern I had assembled from the casualty reports. I could recall Vane's word: adaptation. What had changed was the urgency, the sense that these memories required immediate action, that sitting with them was an unacceptable state, that something needed to be done, that pressure had been reduced. The memories remained, but they had been moved from the category of things that demand response to the category of things that have been addressed. This was, I recognized, a very precise kind of damage. Not erasure, but deflation. The content was present. The capacity to act on it had been adjusted downward. I attended the second session 6 days later. The process was identical. When I stood up from the chair, a little more of the urgency had gone. I returned to the triage bay and began my work. The battlefield triage assignment was not, in objective terms, worse than the implantation role. It was different. The Raven Guard's preference for mobile strike operations meant that the triage function was dispersed rather than centralized, supporting rapid operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. I worked across a variety of environments, from the controlled surgeries aboard void ships to forward stabilization points in the ruins of hive cities and open landscape engagements. The work was technically demanding and often urgent, and required exactly the kind of careful attention to procedure that my training had prepared me for. I was good at it. I was good at it in the way that I had always been good at apothecary work, with the competence that comes from years of accumulated experience, and the particular steadiness of purpose that the chapter's culture produces in those who persist within it. What changed was what happened at the edges of the work. The first time I treated a battle brother from the altered cohort in the triage role, I noticed my own hands moving with a precision that had a slight component of deliberateness to it, as though I were performing steadiness rather than simply being steady. He had a blade wound to the shoulder that was significant but not critical. I cleaned the wound, assessed the extent of the tissue damage, applied the relevant surgical interventions, and prepared the site for biological regeneration. Standard procedure. His skin temperature under my hands was notably below ambient. I noted it internally. I did not record it in the medical log. This was the first time I did that. I want to be precise about what this represents, because imprecision here would be a different kind of dishonesty. I did not omit the temperature finding, because I had been conditioned to omit it. The conditioning had not touched my observational capacity or my awareness of what I was observing. I was entirely aware that I was making a choice not to record a physiologically relevant finding. I made that choice because the finding had a well-established explanation in the chapter's documentation, because recording and the gene stock entered circulation. I omitted a temperature reading, and the documentation of a Battle Brothers biological alteration remained smooth and uninterrupted. The scale was different. The structure was identical. The war zone engagement in the Northern Theatre, the one I was assigned to support during the final weeks of the fourth campaign year, was a situation I am still able to remember with more clarity than I expected the conditioning to leave me. The Raven Guard had cleared a settlement of significant size, a secondary hive that had been serving as a staging point for a heretic force that had been raiding the operational zone supply lines for 7 months. The clearing operation had taken less than a day. When I arrived at the settlement to assess casualties and begin triage operations, the Raven Guard were already withdrawing, and the settlement was in the condition that engagements of this type typically produced. The enemy dead were extensive. I estimated in the range of several hundred, distributed across the settlement's central districts and industrial zones. The usual aftermath of a Raven Guard operation of this scale. I had worked in war zones for long enough that the presence of dead did not particularly affect my functional state. This was not indifference. It was the professional calibration that sustained work in environments of this kind requires. I moved through the settlement with my triage kit and my monitoring equipment, assessing what remained to be done. What struck me was the character of the silence. I had worked in sites of Raven Guard operation before. I was familiar with the particular aftermath atmosphere of engagements conducted by units optimized for stealth and precision. The shock of surviving enemy forces, the absence of structural damage that loud weapons produce, the specific quality of finality that comes when a force is eliminated without understanding it was being eliminated. I knew what these places sounded like when the engagement was over. This was different. The settlement was quiet in the way that deliverance was quiet. Not the quiet of aftermath, not the quiet of shock or sudden cessation of violence, but the constructed quiet of a space that had been designed to suppress sound at the structural level, as though the silence were embedded in the walls and ground and atmosphere, rather than being a temporary condition of the moment. The enemy dead lay in the positions they had occupied when they died. There was no evidence of the kind of physical disturbance that close-quarters combat produces in terms of displacement, scattered equipment, marks of struggle. They had been killed with a precision that had left the physical environment almost entirely undisturbed. I walked through the settlement for the better part of an hour, moving from district to district, assessing. There were no Raven Guard casualties from this engagement. The enemy had sustained total operational losses. The strategic outcome was complete. And yet, the atmosphere of the place was wrong in a way I was only partially able to articulate, even to myself, and that the conditioning had made slightly harder to hold on to precisely than I would have liked. It was the kind of atmosphere that I associated with absences rather than presences, with rooms that had once contained people who were no longer there, rather than rooms that had contained violence. The enemy dead were present, but the sense of what had killed them was not. A settlement of several hundred dead had been made silent, not by force alone, but by the specific quality of force that leaves no impression on the world except the outcome. I stood in the settlement's central plaza for a time. The ground under my feet was dusty stone, undisturbed. The air was still, whilst the light from the local star came down through the settlement's partial roofing, at angles that should have produced distinct shadows on the ground. The shadows were fewer than the angles predicted. not absent, fewer. I noted this in my personal data slate, not in a medical record, not in a campaign document, in the private log that I still maintained with the residual habit of someone who had once believed that recording things carefully was a precaution against forgetting them. I was beginning to understand that this precaution, too, had its limits. The casualty reports from the engagement listed 0 Raven Guard dead, which was accurate. They listed enemy losses at a figure that matched the physical count I conducted. What they did not fully capture was the particular quality of the engagement's aftermath, as the sense I could not shake, even under the dampening effect of the conditioning, that something other than soldiers had moved through this place, or that soldiers had moved through it in a way that was becoming something other than movement. Victory was recorded. The settlement was cleared. The operational objective was met. The report would go up the chain of the Crusade's administrative structure and join the accumulating record of Raven Guard successes in the Pale Spear Crusade, each success indistinguishable in the reporting format from the successes before it, except in its efficiency metrics, which continued to improve. The metrics were improving because the warriors producing them were improving. This was not in question. The question is the one I had asked in the vault, and in the archive, and in the written report that had been received and filed and professionally closed, was whether the thing that was improving was still entirely the thing it had been when improvement began. I had received that question's answer from the system, and the answer was, improvement is correctness, and correctness is sanctified, and sanctioned adaptation within the bounds of the chapter's particular inheritance is not a thing that requires the kind of concern you are describing. I walked back through the settlement toward the extraction point. The silence followed me. I think it had been following me for a long time. Apothecary Drevan was a good practitioner. I observed his work during a shared triage rotation 2 months after my reassignment, and what I saw was competent, careful, and procedurally precise. He conducted post-engagement assessments with exactly the thoroughness the role required. He maintained his documentation to the standard the chapter expected. He performed the litany of shadow before each implantation in the measured tone the rite prescribed. He did not appear to see what I had seen in the vault. This was possible for several reasons. He had not been present for the specific initiations that had first drawn my attention. His monitoring calibration was set to the standard parameters rather than the adjusted ones I had been using. He had not had the particular sequence of experiences that had structured my observation toward its conclusions, or the conditioning had refined the questions out of his training in the way it had refined the urgency out of my memory. I did not know which. I did not ask him. I did not ask anyone anything for a long time after the reassignment. This was partly the conditioning and partly the professional adjustment to a new operational context, and partly something that was neither of those things. It was the quieter adjustment that happens when you have submitted the appropriate documentation through the appropriate channels and received the appropriate response, and understand, with a clarity that does not require additional evidence, that the channels were correct, but the question was not going to produce a different answer, no matter how many times it traveled them. I treated wounds. I performed triage assessments. I signed casualty reports. I attended to the biological needs of the warriors in my care with the full competence my training and experience had built into me. The work was real. The warriors were real. The injuries I treated were real injuries, and the interventions I performed were real interventions, and the outcomes I produced were real outcomes. None of the conditioning and none of the institutional reality I was navigating changed the specific, particular fact of a blade wound that required precise surgical closure, or a crushed limb that required stabilization before the body's regenerative capacity could engage with it. This was what remained when the other things were removed: the concrete and the specific, the work that could be done, and the difference it made to the specific person on the specific slab in front of me. I told myself this was enough to sustain a career. I told myself this was what the chapter required of me. I told myself that the question I had spent 2 years trying to route through appropriate channels was not mine to carry anymore, having been received and processed and answered by those with the authority and expertise to answer it. I told myself these things, and they were not entirely untrue, and they were not entirely sufficient. The 5th campaign year arrived with the rhythm that crusade years always had, measured in operational deployments and supply rotations, and the administrative overhead of maintaining a chapter's warfighting capacity across multiple simultaneous theatres. The chapter moved through the operational zone with the efficiency that had become the defining characteristic of the Pale Spear Crusade's Raven Guard complement, and the efficiency continued to improve, and the campaigns continued to succeed, and the enemy continued to die without understanding how. The Allied Imperial Guard regiments attached to the Crusade had begun to talk about the Raven Guard in a register I had not heard before. Not the usual respect-laced wariness that Astarte's presence typically produced in guardsmen, but something quieter and less categorizable. Regiments that operated in theatres where the Raven Guard had recently engaged reported that they could find no evidence of how the enemy had been killed, that the forensic record of engagements was unusually sparse, that the absence of struggle evidence was unlike anything they had encountered from other Astartes chapters. Commissars from 3 separate regiments filed formal reports about morale impacts associated with working in proximity to the Raven Guard detachments. The reports described a specific morale phenomenon. Guardsmen became more effective at their duties, but reported unusual difficulty maintaining continuous experiential recall of operations conducted alongside Raven Guard units. They remembered outcomes. They remembered their own actions. The Raven Guard portions of the shared operational memory were present but thin, like text that had been written in water. The reports were reviewed by the Crusade's administrative structure and filed under the category of Allied coordination documentation. No action was taken. Allied regiment guardsmen were also reporting that the Raven Guard did not cast shadows. This was an empirical claim, specific, concrete, and directly observable in adequate lighting conditions, and it had moved beyond the whisper register of operational hearsay into formal documentation in at least 2 unit logs I was aware of. I reviewed those logs during a period when my triage rotation gave me access to the Allied Coordination Documentation Archive. I sat with them and read the specific, careful language of frontline soldiers, trying to describe something their observational framework was not built to accommodate. They used the word less rather than absent. They said the shadow was less than it should have been. They said the figures were there, but somehow less there than the environment around them. This was what I had seen in the chapel. What Perrin had called cold. What Evander had called compression. What Tessiver had called attenuation. What the Primarch had wanted to achieve. The 43 new neophytes had been implanted during the 4th year's schedule. The 5th year's projections had been revised upward to 61, reflecting the increased operational demand that came with the Crusade's expansion into additional theatres. Dreven was managing the implantation load with an additional apothecary drawn from the chapter's reserve complement. The altered gene stock from Theta 9 vermilion was contributing approximately the same 60% proportion to the tithe as it had the previous year. There were now, across all active duty assignments in the current Raven Guard complement, slightly more than 120 battle brothers who had received the altered strain. The chapter's current active complement was in the range of 800. 120 warriors who were becoming less present. Scaling at the current rate across one more full crusade cycle would produce a complement in which a significant plurality of battle brothers carried the altered strain. 2 cycles would make it a majority. I did this calculation in my head during a quiet moment in the triage bay. I did not write it down. I filed it in the part of my memory that the conditioning had deflated rather than erased, and I left it there. The triage bay was a forward surgical installation in the current theatre's primary operational zone, set up in a structure that had once been an industrial facility before the Crusade's advance had cleared the area and repurposed the building for Allied use. The structure was functional if graceless, with ceiling heights that accommodated only limited equipment installations, and walls that the local environment had weathered to the point of structural honesty, their age and damage visible in every surface. I worked there for the better part of 4 months during the 5th year, rotating through the installation with 2 other medical staff and a complement of servitors and chapter serfs. The patient load varied with operational tempo. During quiet periods, I spent significant time in maintenance activities, equipment calibration, pharmaceutical stock management, documentation review. During one of these maintenance periods, I reviewed the casualty documentation from the preceding 12 months in preparation for the annual summary report that the chapter's administrative structure required from each medical station. The names in the casualty logs were fewer than the previous year's equivalent list. Not dramatically fewer, but measurably. The reduction was consistent with the efficiency improvements that the battle reports documented, the declining enemy contact, the increasing operational speed, the collapse of resistance in advance of formal engagement. Warriors were dying at a lower rate because the conditions in which they were dying were changing. The corpse recovery rate for the altered cohort remained at 63%. I had not checked this figure since before my reassignment, and its persistence across the intervening period felt like a confirmation of something I had not entirely stopped expecting to see confirmed. I did not include this figure in the annual summary report. The report format asked for recovered remains and unrecovered remains and the reasons attributed to non-recovery. I completed the report accurately for the warriors whose cases I was directly responsible for. The altered cohort's cases had been transferred to Drevan's administrative purview, along with the implantation oversight role, and I was not responsible for their documentation. I signed the summary report. I sent it to the administrative structure. I returned to the equipment calibration that I had been working on before the review. The maintenance work had a quality of presence in it that I valued more than I had expected to when the reassignment first landed. Calibrating a monitoring array required precision and attention, and when precision and attention were functioning correctly, they occupied the space that other things might otherwise fill. I had discovered that careful work of this kind was a useful companion to a mind that had been partially cleared of its more insistent cargo. This was not wisdom. I want to be precise about that. It was adaptation. The conditioning had adjusted the pressure, and in the reduced pressure space, I had found that functional purpose expanded to fill available volume. This is what well-designed conditioning produces. Not a damaged mind, but a redirected one. A mind that functions effectively within its new parameters, without the residual friction that comes from having the old parameters still active. I was functioning effectively. I was serving the chapter's requirements. I was providing value to the Crusade's operational capability. I was, in every formally measurable dimension, an asset rather than a liability. The cost of this was not dramatic. It was not a dramatic cost. It was a cost that I was aware of in the way that you are aware of a sound that has been present for so long that you no longer hear it as sound, but only as a component of the ambient environment that would be noticeable by its absence. The part of me that had stood in the vault and signed the slate, while knowing that the shadow fell at the wrong angle, was still present. The conditioning had not removed it. It had simply placed it at a distance, a controlled distance, measured and maintained. I was aware of it the way I was aware of the temperature of the altered cohort skin. Present, noted, not recorded. This was what the chapter required. What I required was not currently relevant to the operation. I completed the calibration. I stowed the tools. I ate the rations assigned to my maintenance cycle and returned to duty. A battle brother was brought to the triage bay 2 days later with a projectile wound to the lower torso, significant but survivable with prompt intervention. He was from the altered cohort, his gene seed designation visible in the patient registration the attending serf had completed on intake. He was conscious and lucid, which was a good sign for his recovery prospects, and he lay on the triage slab with the controlled stillness that the altered cohort had always displayed, that quality of apparent quietness that was not passivity, but something more deliberate. I worked on his wound with the focused attention the situation required. The projectile had penetrated to a depth that required precise extraction and careful layered repair. There was substantial tissue damage, but the critical structures beneath had been spared by the penetration angle. He would recover fully within a period consistent with Astarte's regenerative capacity. His skin was cold under my hands, several degrees below ambient. I noted it internally and did not record it. Halfway through the procedure, as I was completing the deep tissue layer repair, I became aware that the ambient lighting in the triage bay had shifted. The monitoring array's indicator lights were functioning. The overhead illumination strips were active. The light they produced was reaching me, and the slab and the surgical field. But the area immediately around the battle brother seemed to receive it less fully than the surrounding space, as though he were positioned at the center of a small region where the light arrived but did not fully land. I completed the procedure. I packed and sealed the wound site. I administered the post-surgical pharmaceutical protocol. He looked at me once, before the sedation took effect. The same level look I had seen from Erevain in the surgical bay debrief. No communication I could interpret. No expression I could read. Just a focus that felt like presence, even though everything else about him was moving in the other direction. I said the litany of shadow over him in the low voice the rite prescribed, not because the situation formally required it, but because it was what I had. The 7 passages. The language about purposeful invisibility as devotion. The rhythm that matched careful work. His breathing slowed into the sedation pattern. The light in the bay around him remained as it was. I cleaned my instruments. I updated the patient file with the procedure details. I left the temperature field at ambient. The annual summary reports for the 5th campaign year showed the metrics that had been building across the preceding years, expressed now in numbers large enough that the pattern was visible to anyone who chose to observe it. Raven Guard operational efficiency across all engaged theatres was at the highest level in the Crusades campaign record. Casualty ratios were exceptional. Enemy contact to elimination rates had reached a level that the campaign's strategic analysts noted as historically unusual. Allied regiment commanders filed performance assessments of Raven Guard coordination that used language I recognized from the Guardsmen's earlier reports. The same vocabulary of lessness, of operations conducted by forces that were present in outcome and reduced in presence. One assessment from a senior militarum general whose experience covered 3 decades of warfighting described the experience of operating alongside the Raven Guard detachments as similar to working alongside very effective weather. The comparison was meant, I think, as a compliment. Weather achieves its effects without announcing itself. Weather does not require visibility to be consequential. Weather arrives and departs on its own terms. Weather also does not appear in casualty reports. Weather is not recoverable. The 5th year ended without the formal ceremony that had marked earlier campaign milestones. The Raven Guard did not mark their own continuance with ceremony. The chapter moved from one operational phase to the next with the same silent momentum it had always carried. And the momentum was now augmented by a capacity that 10,000 years of the chapter's existence had been pointing toward without quite arriving at. I attended the year-end briefing for the medical staff. I received my operational assignments for the 6th year. I signed the relevant documentation. I departed the briefing without having said anything that had not been required by the procedural format of the meeting. In the corridor, outside the briefing room, I walked past a group of battle brothers from the altered cohort who were moving toward the deployment bays for a transit assignment. There were 7 of them, moving in the unhurried precision of Astartes in functional motion, their armor sealed, their bearing composed. The corridor lighting was adequate. The floor under them was visible. The walls beside them cast the shadows that architectural surfaces produce in the presence of illumination. The battle brothers cast shadows that were present but lighter than the floor's material color, and the lighting angle should have produced. Not absent. Lighter. As though the light that struck them passed through a medium that offered less resistance than the physical world typically did. I watched them pass. I continued to my own destination. I had a private log. I still maintained it. The conditioning had not removed the habit, only the urgency. I opened it that evening in the small quarters assigned to my triage station role, with the pale blue-white illumination of the desk lumen adjusted to the level I worked best under. And I wrote what I wanted to write. It was not long. It was not a formal document. It was a record of the thing I understood that could not be submitted through appropriate channels, because the appropriate channels had already received it and processed it and filed it under sanctioned adaptation. I wrote that the sons of Corax were victorious, that the Crusades' record demonstrated this in terms that could not be disputed and would not be disputed and had not been disputed, that the gene stock that the Primarch had preserved in Theta 9 Vermilion and that the chapter had been using for the past 2 campaign years was producing the kind of warrior that the doctrine of the Raven Guard had always described as the ideal. I wrote that the cost of this production was not visible in the battle reports or the efficiency metrics or the sanctification reviews. The cost was in what was becoming less. Not the warrior's capacity, not their loyalty, not their effectiveness in the purposes for which they had been made. What was becoming less was the substance of their presence in the world. The material relationship between their existence and the physical environment was attenuating in the direction the Primarch had sought, and it was doing so stably, progressively, and at a rate that scaled with implantation volume. I wrote that I had signed the first slate, that I had signed the ones after it, that I had omitted temperature readings from triage records and corpse recovery rates from summary reports, and that these omissions were each individually minor and collectively a contribution to the documentation architecture that had allowed the process to continue without friction. I wrote that the chapter's future, as I understood it, was toward continued achievement and towards something that achieving had a tendency to produce when the achievement was the reduction of presence rather than the expansion of it, toward warriors who won absolutely and left less trace each year, and who would, at some terminus I could not calculate, have achieved the Primarch's complete vision, towards sons who were perfect instruments of absence. I wrote that the horror of this was not that it had happened, but that it had happened correctly. Every step had been procedurally correct. Every authorization had been properly issued. Every sanction had been appropriately obtained. The conditioning I had received was administered by someone with the training and mandate to administer it, for reasons documented in the appropriate format, achieving outcomes consistent with the chapter's operational requirements. There had been no villain. There had been no conspiracy. There had been an apothecary in a vault, and a gene stock tithe, and a parchment slate, and a stylus lifted at the end of a long watch, and the rest had followed from that with the mechanical inevitability of a system functioning exactly as designed. I wrote all of this in the log. Then I closed it and set it aside. The 6th year's operational schedule began with a transit phase that occupied most of the first month. The chapter moved between theatres in the quiet efficiency of void travel, and during transit I performed my triage maintenance duties and attended the required briefings, and ate and slept within the parameters my biology demanded. There were more altered cohort members in the visible population of the ship than there had been at the equivalent point in the 4th year. The implantation schedule had been running at the projected 60% rate for 2 full years now, and the cumulative effect was visible in the simple proportion of faces I encountered that carried the altered gene stock's characteristic pallor and shadow recoil and quality of lightness in the world. The corridors of the ship had acquired a quality that I noticed during transit operations more than I noticed it during the focused activity of active campaign periods. A quality of acoustic compression that the ship's own systems could not fully explain. A thinner sound environment than a vessel of this size and crew complement should have produced. The ambient frequencies were present but muted. Conversations in corridors reached me at slightly lower volume than the distances should have allowed. The triage bay had the same acoustic quality. So did the briefing rooms. So did the common areas where chapter serfs and mortal support staff conducted their daily activities. It was not silence in the way that Deliverance's constructed silence was silent. Deliverance had been built to produce that quality deliberately through architectural choices made with full intent. This was something different. This was silence arriving through a process rather than through design, accumulating in the spaces where the altered cohort spent time, depositing itself in the environment the way that temperature deposits itself in stone over long exposure. The ship was changing its acoustic character in the direction of the chapter that lived in it. I raised this with no one. The meditations I had access to, the Raven Guard's doctrinal texts concerning the chapter's identity and purpose, and the nature of service to the Emperor and Primarch, contained passages I had read throughout my career, but which now produced a different resonance in me than they had before. Not because the words had changed, because I had changed in the way that the conditioning designed to achieve, and the changed version of me read the texts differently. The foundational doctrine of the Raven Guard states that the chapter exists as a weapon of precision, that its purpose is the elimination of enemies who cannot otherwise be reached, that its method is the occupation of the space between known and unknown, between sight and blindness, between the moment before consequence and consequence itself. This is not a metaphor in the Raven Guard's usage. It is a literal, operational description. The chapter lives in the gap. That is what the doctrine says. That is what the gene seed prepares a warrior to do. To move in the gap, to act in the gap, to achieve outcomes in the gap, without being reduced to the presence exposing limitations of announced force. I had always read this as a description of tactical methodology, a way of fighting, a philosophy of approach that produced superior operational outcomes by reducing the enemy's ability to orient and respond. Now I read it as a description of what the altered gene stock was producing, not a tactical philosophy, but an ontological direction. Warriors who did not merely move through gaps, but who were becoming less anchored to the side of the gap that is visible. Like the doctrine had not predicted this, or it had predicted it and framed it as aspiration, without specifying what aspiration, fully achieved, would cost. This thought arrived from something happening, which was the transit ship's corridors, which were quieter than they should have been, which was caused by something real and observable. I permitted myself to hold it, because the rules I had been given about thought and doctrine specified that abstract musings without immediate cause did not belong in the record, and this one had cause that I could have pointed to with my hand. The transit phase ended. The chapter entered the new theatre. The operational tempo resumed. I worked in the triage bay. I treated wounds. I signed reports. I recited the litany of shadow when the ritual context called for it, and sometimes when it did not, when the bay was quiet in the early watches, and I needed something with a cadence that matched careful hands. A guardsman from an allied regiment was brought to my triage station during the theatre's first major operation, a joint assault on a fortified position that had required Raven Guard participation to neutralize a key defensive system the Militarum forces could not approach undetected. He had sustained a wound that brought him into my care rather than the Militarum's own medical facilities, due to the proximity of my station to the forward edge of the engagement zone. I treated his wound. It was a significant wound, the kind that required focused attention and careful technique, and I gave it both. He was conscious throughout, which made the work harder in some ways and easier in others. Conscious patients could report their sensory state, which provided useful information for calibrating the intervention. He was lucid and frightened in the controlled way of experienced soldiers who understand what has happened to them well enough to be concerned rather than overwhelmed. He watched what I was doing with the focused attention of someone who has decided that watching the work is preferable to the alternatives. Halfway through the procedure, he said, very quietly, that he could not see the Raven Guard anymore. He did not mean it literally. He clarified this himself, without prompting, as though he had been thinking about it for some time and had decided to articulate what he meant. He said that during the operation, when the Raven Guard elements that should have been visible to him in his field of position had ceased to register in his observation, not moved away from him, ceased to register while still being, as far as he could determine from operational outcomes, present. He said it felt like trying to see something that was not quite there. I told him to hold still and focus on his breathing, and that I needed another few minutes to complete the procedure. He complied. He was a good patient. When the procedure was done and the pharmaceutical protocol was running, I sat beside the triage slab for a moment and let myself be still. The bay was quiet in its accumulated way. The monitoring arrays hummed. The light fell at the angles it fell at. The guardsman had gone under the sedation. He breathed in the slow, regular pattern of someone resting rather than wounded. His color was acceptable. His vitals were stable. He would recover. He had described the altered cohort in exactly the language I would have used if I had been trying to describe what I had been observing for the past 2 campaign years to someone who had not been inside the process, trying to see something that was not quite there. Not absent, not quite there. This was the chapter's victory. This was what the sanctification reviews had approved, and the battle reports had celebrated, and the Allied commanders had described as remarkably effective weather. Warriors who were not quite there. I stood up from beside the slab. I returned to my equipment maintenance. The monitoring arrays required recalibration at the intervals my schedule specified, and the intervals did not adjust themselves to accommodate other considerations. The 6th year passed the way the 5th had, with the accumulated momentum of a process that was operating as intended, and had been operating as intended since before I was in a position to affect it, and would continue operating as intended after my tenure in any role adjacent to it had concluded. Operations proceeded. Victories accrued. The record of the Raven Guard in the Pale Spear Crusade grew to a length and density that would require dedicated archival processing to fully document. I received a routine performance commendation at the year's end, noting my satisfactory contribution to the Crusade's medical support infrastructure. The commendation was signed by the chapter's senior apothecary, a figure whose access to the full campaign record was presumably broader than mine. The commendation noted that my work in battlefield triage had been valuable, and that my transition from the implantation role had been handled with appropriate professionalism. I read the commendation once. I filed it in the documentation archive. I returned to my duties. The 7th year began without ceremony. I want to describe what the 7th year felt like, not as a report, but as the lived experience of it, because this is where the record I was permitted to keep begins to lose its granular texture, and the events become harder to hold on to precisely. The conditioning had continued to do its work across the preceding years, not through additional sessions, simply through the time that passed after the sessions, which allowed the initial adjustment to settle and stabilize and become the new baseline. I was aware, in the 7th year, that my memory of the period before my reassignment had a different quality than my memory of the period after. Earlier memories were present but possessed a kind of flat affect in comparison to the events I had experienced since, not erased, flattened, as though they had been left in the sun for too long and the contrast had washed out. This is an imprecise metaphor, The conditioning was not photonic, but the experiential result was similar. Earlier events were present, accessible, and drained of the urgency they had once carried. I continued to maintain my private log, but the entries became shorter in the 7th year, not because less was happening, but because the gap between what happened and what I felt called to record had narrowed. The habit of documentation persisted. The compulsion that had originally powered it had been reduced to something quieter. The chapter moved like a rumor. That phrase had appeared in multiple Allied force assessments across the past 2 years, and I had encountered it enough times that it had stopped being distinctive and become simply accurate. The Raven Guard moved through war zones, and the enemy died, and the record of how and where and in what physical sequence the dying occurred was thinner than the outcome justified. Resistance collapsed. Objectives were achieved. The machinery of the crusade advanced. The Allied regiments who operated in the Raven Guard's operational corridor had developed a set of informal practices around the chapter's presence. Not avoidance, not protocol, something between the two. A habit of not looking directly, of noting outcomes rather than processes, of asking fewer operational questions than coordination would normally require. I had heard a militarum colonel describe working alongside the Raven Guard as working alongside something you were better off not fully describing, not because they were frightening, but because the act of full description tended to produce accounts that sounded wrong when stated plainly. The Allied forces had arrived, empirically, at the same conclusion I had written in my private log years earlier. They lacked the specific vocabulary to articulate it in its full form. They lacked the access to the documentation I had assembled and deleted and reassembled in memory. But they were producing the same assessment through experience that I had produced through attention. The Raven Guard were becoming something that full description struggled to hold. I treated a battle brother from the earliest cohort of the Altered Strain during the 7th year. During a field operation in the 3rd Theatre of the current campaign phase. He had been serving in active duty for 5 years since his implantation. He was, in every functional metric the chapter measured, an exceptional warrior. Combat record exemplary, physical condition excellent, loyalty assessment clean. He sat in my triage station for a post-engagement health assessment that the operational protocols required for extended field operations. Now I worked through the assessment systematically. Cardiac function, neurological response, metabolic indicators, tissue integrity, gene seed organ function. His gene seed organs registered as functioning. The monitoring array's confirmed integration was stable and complete. His cardiac function was within the range of accepted Astartes parameters. His core temperature was 7 degrees below the ambient temperature of the assessment room. Not a few degrees. 7. This was a figure that would have, in the early period of my career, generated an immediate emergency response. Astartes' physiology was capable of wide temperature regulation, but the variation I was measuring was outside the range of voluntary thermoregulation. It implied a fundamental metabolic shift of a kind that healthy biology did not produce. He showed no symptoms of metabolic distress. He sat in the assessment chair with complete composure. His tissue color was the consistent pale of the altered cohort. His eyes were dark and level. I completed the assessment. I recorded his core temperature as within an expanded acceptable range that the chapter's current medical documentation, updated over the preceding campaign years to accommodate findings of this kind, had established for the altered cohort. The expanded range had been formally approved by the sanctification authorities in a procedural document I had received as a standard medical staff notification 12 months earlier. The documentation was correct. The recording was consistent with the documentation. The battle brother was cleared for continued operational duty. He left the assessment station, and I sat for a moment, looking at the temperature reading on the monitoring array. 7 degrees. The number had a specificity that numbers always have, indifferent to what you do with them, present in themselves regardless of what the documentation decided to call them. I thought about the vault. I thought about the parchment slate. I thought about the temperature of Erevein's skin in the early implantation records, and how it had been a few degrees below ambient then, and how 7 years of campaigning had moved that number by another 4 degrees in the same direction. Direction was the thing. The direction had been established from the beginning and had not changed. The numbers moved along the direction at whatever rate the biology produced, and the documentation moved to accommodate the numbers, and the operations continued, and the victories accumulated. The direction did not change. I closed the assessment record. I filed it with the appropriate administrative station. I returned to the maintenance activities that the quiet period between operational rotations permitted. The maintenance work was still good. It was still something that occupied the hands and the attention in the way that careful work does. I was grateful for it in the quiet way that you become grateful for things that have sustained you across long periods, when other things have changed around them. The chapter's casualty list for the 7th year was the shortest in the Crusade's history, fewer than 20 names. For a chapter complement operating across multiple simultaneous theatres in active warfare, this was a figure that no historical precedent quite explained. The tactical analyses attributed it to operational refinement, to the accumulation of campaign experience, to the exceptional performance quality of current personnel. I knew also that it reflected the altered cohort's survival characteristics. Warriors who were less present in the material world were also necessarily less present as targets. A thing that registers faintly on auspex is a thing that is harder to aim at. A thing that moves through 11 minutes without existing on any sensor system is a thing that is difficult to kill during those 11 minutes. The Primarch had understood this. He had designed for this. The survival rates were not a coincidence. They were the goal. The cost of this survival was what the private log said it was. What I had been watching accumulate across 7 years of service to the chapter and the Crusade. The gradual, progressive, irreversible reduction in the substance of presence. Not capacity, presence. The warriors were more capable than ever, and less there than ever, and the two facts were not in tension with each other. They were the same fact, expressed at different levels of the same scale. I was alive. I performed my duties. I maintained my records within the parameters I had been given, and my private log within the parameters I had given myself. The 8th year arrived. More operations. More victories. The Raven Guard moved across the theatre like weather in the Militarum commander's memorable phrase, and the enemy fell before them, and the crusade advanced. I walked the corridors of deliverance during a resupply rotation in the 9th month of the 8th year, on a transit back to the fortress monastery for an extended maintenance and sanctification period that the chapter's cycle required every several years. The corridors were the same corridors they had always been, cut from the same dark basalt, with the same constructed silence, the same narrow proportions, the same lumen globes providing the same pale illumination. The shadows in the corridors were fewer than they had been the last time I walked them. I do not mean this impressionistically. I mean that the number of shadows cast by the warriors and serfs and servitors moving through those corridors was measurably reduced relative to the ambient lighting and the number of individuals present. I walked the primary transit corridor from the docking bay to the apothecarian level and counted, in the way that a mind trained to careful observation counts without formal intent, and the number did not match what it should have matched. The Raven Guard were present. They moved through the corridors in the routines that fortress monastery life required. They performed the duties that the maintenance and sanctification period prescribed. They ate and trained and prepared for the campaign rotation's continuation. They cast fewer shadows. Not no shadows. Fewer. The same direction the temperature readings and the corpse recovery rates and the acoustic quality of the ship's corridors had been pointing in for years, as accumulated in the simple geometry of light and surface, and the thing between them that should have been a certain size and was less. I completed my own maintenance and sanctification duties during the fortress monastery period. I attended the prescribed rituals. I underwent the physical assessments that the chapter's medical cycle required of its apothecaries. I passed them all. My own physiology was entirely normal. Standard gene seed integration, standard metabolic function, standard temperature regulation. I was not from the altered cohort. I had been made from the original Raven Guard gene stock, unmodified. And whatever I was becoming across 8 years of service in proximity to this process, I was not becoming what they were becoming. I was becoming something different, smaller in a different way. Not the attenuation of presence, but the attenuation of the person who watches presence attenuate and does not stop it, and cannot stop it, and has found, over time, a form of continued function within that inability. The log I was permitted to keep ended on the last day of the fortress monastery period, not because I chose to end it, but because the rotation schedule called for departure the following morning, and I sat down in the evening to write what I understood and found that the understanding had a completeness to it that felt like conclusion. I wrote it the way I had written previous entries, without excess, without the language that did not arise from things happening, without the philosophical ornamentation that served no function except the expression of a feeling the ornamentation could not change. I wrote that the sons of Korax were victorious, that the Crusades' record would stand as one of the most successful in the chapter's documented history, that fewer warriors were dying and more objectives were being achieved, and the enemy was collapsing in advance of engagement at rates that historical analysis would find remarkable. I wrote that the chapter was achieving the Primarch's original design. The sons of Korax were becoming less present in the material world and more precise in their consequences within it, and the distance between these two states was the operational reality that 10,000 years of doctrine had been building toward, and that the gene stock from Theta 9 Vermilion had begun to actualize at scale. I wrote that I understood the curse now. It was not mutation. It was not madness. It was not the shame of the raptor tragedy, which had been excess and desperation, and the failure of method. This was method succeeding. This was the curse of success in the specific direction that the chapter had always moved, the direction made explicit and operational by the Primarch's preserved work. The Raven Guard were becoming perfect instruments of absence. Absence from observation, absence from detection, absence from the thermal and visual and acoustic registers by which the physical world tracks itself and its contents. The enemy could not see them. The allies could not fully describe them. The documentation could not fully hold them. And one day, at the terminus of the direction the numbers had been pointing in for years, the documentation might cease to try. I wrote that I had signed the first slate, that I was a part of this, that the part I was would not come apart from the whole, because the whole was now too large and had too much momentum and had been too thoroughly absorbed into the administrative reality of the crusade and the chapter's institutional identity. I wrote that one day there might be nothing left of the sons of Korax to remember, that the victory would be complete, and the warriors who had achieved it would have achieved it by becoming something that memory, like the monitoring arrays and the lumen globes and the lenses of Allied soldiers' observational frameworks, struggled to hold. I wrote that the silence of deliverance had always been a constructed thing, that the best silence is designed, and that the chapter had been designing itself, with my signature on the relevant documentation, toward the final silence, and the silence that is not constructed but achieved. Then I closed the log and prepared my equipment for the morning departure. I reported to the deployment bay at the prescribed time. I attended the departure blessing administered by the chaplain. I moved with the company of warriors toward the shuttle that would return us to the Crusade's operational theatre. The bay was lit in the standard pale blue-white of Raven Guard interior illumination. Warriors moved through it in the quiet efficiency of a chapter accustomed to transitions. The shadows on the floor were fewer than the number of individuals present justified. I did not count them this time. I found my assigned position in the shuttle's interior, secured my equipment, and waited for departure. Around me, the chapter's sons moved and breathed and prepared with the composed steadiness of those who have internalized their purpose to the point that purpose and person are no longer distinguishable. They were very good. They had always been very good. They would continue to be very good. In theatres I would serve in, and theatres I would never know. And the victories would accumulate, and the shadows would grow fewer, and the cold would deepen in the skin of the warriors under my care, and the monitoring arrays would register it all within the expanded acceptable parameters, and the documentation would continue to reflect a chapter functioning within the bounds of its sanctioned identity. I would continue to perform triage, to treat wounds, to sign the reports that my role required, to maintain the log that no one read, and that I maintained not from the urgency that the conditioning had removed, but from the habit that outlasted the urgency. The shuttle lifted, or the bay receded below us. Deliverance's dark face grew smaller in the exterior views. And then we were in the void, and the fortress monastery was a point of shadow against the lesser darkness. I looked at it for as long as it remained visible. The sons of Korax were victorious. And somewhere, in the vaults beneath that receding darkness, in the archive levels where the silence was oldest and the cold was deepest, the gene stock from Theta 9 vermilion waited in its regulated preservation, ready for the next tithe, and the next, and the next. I had signed the first slate. I was still signing slates. The shuttle carried us into the dark between the stars, and the Raven Guard sat around me in the pale light, and the light that fell on them arrived and did not quite land, and I performed the duties my role required, and the chapter continued on its course. And one day, there may be nothing left of us to remember.